Okay, we're going to be talking about how to conduct interviews. Interviews are the life blood, literally, of our yearbook being successful. Obviously, we have to have great pictures, but when we look at those pictures, if we don't have interesting information and detailed information, then the book doesn't really become that historical document that we want it to be. So we want to have as many details as possible, and we don't have a lot of space to put those details, so getting the right details is going to be critical in your interviews, which is why we're going to do some tips and tricks today to kind of get you fast-tracked to creating successful interviews. So, as you are looking along with me on this document, you can see that the first thing I want to talk about are open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions. So open-ended questions, as I say here, are essential to your interview. Closed will literally close the door on your interview. You will have nothing to use. And so a lot of times we don't realize that we're writing those types of questions. So that's one of the first things you have to analyze when you look at your interview questions before you call someone down. And you should always show me your questions before you do an interview so that you make sure you're on the right track, because you're all still in that learning phase. So take a look at the example closed question. Do you like jazz band? So if I ask a student that, they're going to say yes or they're going to say no. And they're not going to say much else, especially because they're really nervous about coming down here. You might think, well, then you could say why. But it's not as good as if you rephrase the question to be open. So the open-ended question, tell me what you like about jazz band. And look what we get with that interview. Oh, it's a lot better than regular band. There's more creativity, and we get more say in what and how we play. Also, it's more elite, meaning only the best to get to be part of it, and that makes our music really good. So which one of these questions would give you more to write a caption with? It's pretty obvious, the open-ended question. But I still see students quite often writing closed-ended questions. Closed questions give you nothing to write your captions with. No information is supplied. So we want to make sure that you understand that we want to do the hows, the tell me, those types of questions. You know, how were you guys able to win the game? Not what was the score, you know. And you'll probably know the score before the person shows up if you're doing proper research. So those kinds of things you can develop into better questions. So let's talk about that. So we're going to look at two scenarios here. One is questions for an academic interview. You can see we have a picture of two of my students from last year. I can tell you in the background, because I know what's going on, that they were doing research and preparing for a constitutional convention. But you might not know that. You can see that there's a sign there that says Rhode Island. You can see that they're discussing something. You know that it's a history or social studies class because you came in and shot it. But you need more information. And so the questions that I have set up here are basically kind of a starting guide to give you a good foundation for an interview, but you can always include more and should include more if you feel like you have things you want to ask. So the first question we always ask in an interview is to say and spell your name. This is so important. We cannot have misspelled names in our yearbook. It is absolutely unacceptable. Also, sometimes students don't go by the full name that they have in our yearbook drive. So for example, I have a student named Terrence this year who goes by Bubba. And all his family calls him Bubba, and his name is Bubba. So we would want to put Bubba Smith, not Terrence Smith. So those are the kinds of reasons why the very first question we ask the student to do is to say and spell their name. So the second question we always ask is, tell me what's happening in this picture. And we have the picture available for the student to see. You are going to put it in your document with your questions, and you're going to have this document open when the student shows up for the interview. So they can say, oh yeah, I was working with Jenna on the Constitutional Convention. We were both from Rhode Island, and we were prepping our arguments. All right, that's a pretty decent little start there. Okay, so my next question Yeah, so who's your history teacher? Oh, that's Mackey's class. Okay, that's a closed-ended question, but we're just doing a little probing follow-up. So now we're going to build into that next question where we make a comment about our observation of the picture. So that would be number 4. You look like you are what? Tell me more about that. So that's where I have right here. Fill this in with something to create a conversation. You look like you guys are pretty seriously discussing something. Can you remember at all what you were discussing? Can you tell me more about what you guys were doing there? Oh, yeah, we were discussing slavery and how we were going to fight against the southern states to come up with arguments about why slavery was wrong, because the Constitutional Convention argument that we were debating was about whether or not slaves should be counted towards a state's population. So we were working on our arguments to try to prepare to go against them. All right, so now I've got way more information than I did by just what's going on in this picture, okay? And then I want to build on that a little bit more by going kind of broader, especially because if this is like a math class or something that we are unfamiliar with, a subject we're unfamiliar with, or a grade we're unfamiliar with, we might need more information. And the best way to get that is to kind of go larger now. So you guys do the Constitutional Convention. Tell me more about that unit or this lesson. Like, what do you guys do? That sounds really cool. And I would make sure that you say it like that. Don't just sound boring and dull. Like, actually engage in the conversation with them. So then they can say, oh, yeah, this was a really cool assignment that we were doing. All of us were assigned delegates to be delegates, and we were all assigned a state, and we had to reenact the Constitutional Convention, except that we were responsible for doing our own research and having to present our arguments with our own thinking. And that was part of our unit on how our country came to be formed. So now we've got a little bit bigger, more information to go with that about the unit. So tell me, after you got done with all of that, what did you learn from doing this this lesson, this activity? What did you learn? And they say, I found out that it was a lot more complicated than it seemed like. Everybody just thinks slavery is wrong, and it is. But when we reenacted this, we found out that the economy of the South was so tied to slavery that it was really hard for the representatives to stand up to their constituents and say this is wrong, because it was so much about money. And even though our state, we were fortunate in that we got to say it's not okay, we could learn the perspective of the other side and kind of see why maybe slavery lasted so much longer than it should have during the time period. Wow. Okay, well, if everybody is as chatty as me, you're going to have a great interview. They may or may not be that chatty, so you may have to try to interject along the way with some extra probing questions, So if they kind of go, I don't know what I really learned, say, well, think back on it, is there something you improved upon, or is there something that you took away from that sticks out in your mind? So don't let them off the hook with, I don't know, nothing. Don't let them off the hook like that. So that is a typical academic interview. Now, one more question that I would include, and I have this in my tips at the end of this lecture, is that you should also say at the very end of an interview, is there anything else you want me to know about your history class, or about the Constitutional Convention, or about Mrs. Mackey's class in general, or something like that? Is there anything else you want me to know? And they may say no, but they may also say, oh, well, it was pretty interesting that, we had in our debate that the slaveholding states ended up actually overpowering the North, which wasn't what really happened in history. I have no idea if they're going to give you something or not, but in particular with sports, sometimes interesting things can come up because we don't ask the right questions. So always end the interview with, is there anything else you'd like me to know about this? And then always thank them for coming. Let's roll into the sports interview. Okay, so I have a guy who has the ball, and we've got a guy coming in at him here, and we've got a guy coming in at here, and we've got another guy here. So I'm probably going to interview what would be really smart, if I really wanted to get as much information as possible, is to bring the two of these guys down. Number one, it makes them more comfortable. Same thing up here, actually. If I had brought both of these students down to talk together, this probably would have been a really great idea because they'd be more comfortable and you'd get a lot more information. So if I could get both students down here, great. If I can't, I get one of them down here. And I start exactly the same way. Except this time, before I conduct this interview, I will have done a little bit of research on the game. So I'm going to know who the opponent was. I'm going to do my best to find out what the score was so that I have a little bit of information to base my questions around. So in this case, they beat St. Francis 36-10, which was a pretty big deal. So first question, say and spell your name. Second question, tell me what's happening in this photo. And this guy's going to say, well, I'm trying to break through a tackle and the guy next to me is trying to make sure that that guy doesn't get me. And they're going to say this in a way better way because they understand sports and I don't. But they're going to explain what's happening in the photo. Now I'm going to use that research that I went out and got in my next question. Wow, I saw that you guys beat St. Francis 36-10. You guys crushed them, you know. Tell me more about that. How'd you do it? You know, and that's going to get them in that conversation, okay? And you definitely need something to show interest in what was going on in the game, okay? All right, what else can you tell me about this game that I need to know? Like, what was key or critical to this game? Did anyone get hurt? Was it weird weather? Was there anything going on strangely? So that's where I get into these probing questions. What was the opponent like? If it's a cross-country meet, what was the terrain like? What kind of course was this? Tell me about the course, you know, something like that. So again, don't say to them, was the course hard? Because they'll say yes or no. Say, tell me more about this course in comparison to other ones. You know, something like that. It's always interesting to ask how you felt about, to ask the student how they felt about their performance in this race, game, meet, or contest, especially when it's like cross country and they have personal records they're trying to beat, their own PRs and stuff. That can be really good. You could also ask, you know, since those two guys are in the picture together, you know, how did you feel about your team's performance? Or how did you feel about your partner in this picture's performance in this game? Or, you know, something like that. So, and obviously if it was some huge loss, you're not going to want to throw the other person under the bus. But maybe if it was a big loss, you could say, wow, you guys kind of got crushed. What do you think went wrong? How could you guys do a better job? You know, what kinds of things do you need to work on? Those types of questions, okay? All right, some tips. Make sure you are prepared before your person arrives. Your Google Doc should be totally ready with your questions, with the picture in the document for the student to see, Chromebook open, recording app ready, a chair pulled out for the student so they don't have to stand there and feel awkward. You guys sit on one side of a table, the interview sits on the other side, okay? Tell your friends and any distracting stuff going on in the room, you know, out of my way, people, I've got an interview to do. And come and tell me. I'll get the room more quiet if that's what needs to happen. Record the entire interview and save it to your Google Drive. Last year we had some problems with the recording app saving. It would take a really long time and sometimes students were losing interviews. That can be frustrating. I'm hoping that I have a workaround with a new recording app called MicNote, but we're going to have to test this. I would stay away from like 225 interviews because then you only have 5 minutes for that recording to process before you walk out the door and lose your Wi-Fi connection and potentially lose your interview. So I would keep my last interview right at 220. You want to, while you're having that interview, you want to make eye contact and converse with the person. So you could take a couple notes, but really I would engage more in the conversation and trust the recording, you know, to get you there. Say and spell the name is always the first question. Do not ever forget that. You have to have that information. Always, as I said, at the end, especially with the sports. So if we went back to that and we talked about this, say, is there anything else you would want me to know or you think is really important to know about this particular game or this play or this meet or this whatever? And find out if there's something you're not asking about. Oh my God, that's the game where J-Mo broke his leg, or that's the game that put us into the conference finals. Some things that we might not know. So that's why it's important to ask that question. And then always be ready to go off script, okay? So sometimes I see students, they've got 4 questions and some kid is talking about something that's really important to them, and I see the student just staring at their question, ready to ask the next one and not really acknowledging that there's a different direction that this kid wants to go in, So if the football player says, that's the game that J-Mo broke his leg, and you go, oh, but what was the score, or how did you feel about your performance in the game, you're not following the conversation. You would be like, oh my God, someone broke their leg in the game? What did you guys do? How did that affect your ability to play? You got to go off script and you got to follow what your person is telling you, okay? That's super important. Listening is so important to an interview. Thank them for coming, not thanks them for coming. See, I'll get rid of that. Thank them for coming and ask if you can email any follow-up questions that might come along the way, okay? And obviously we have all the student email accounts at our disposal. We can also follow-up interview through email our teachers and our coaches and our advisors for different clubs. So if we need that little bit of extra detail, we can do that as well, and you should, okay? But the best way to get the most information here is to have a quality moment, a 5 to 10 minute moment with a student where you are actively engaged and have quality open-ended questions to have a successful interview. So, based on these notes and what you've just listened to, you have a short quiz to take to show me that you have an understanding of what you need to do to conduct a successful interview. Thank you.